All right, good morning. Welcome. Thank you for taking your time, joining me here for a Windows 10 deployment expert level session. 60 minutes, tips and tricks around Windows 10 deployments. I'm Johan, and I will be your host for the next 60 minutes. I absolutely love questions, so if you have any, just out with them. I'll be happy to answer. Now, this session, of course, doesn't only happen here in Spectrum in Oslo, but it happens also online. So I'm monitoring the Twitter feed, of course, on this laptop over here. So if you tag questions with NICconf and my last name, I'll have at least a chance to find them in the stream, passing by pretty quickly. And if you're not on Twitter, get on Twitter. It's simply no better medium today, in my opinion, to get updates about what's going on in the MDT, ConfigMgr, OS deployment space. You probably know by now that Microsoft are stepping up the cadence pretty quickly in terms of releases, updates. Every other week there is an update of something. Every other month there is a new release of something, a new version of something. So Twitter is just a fantastic way to keep up with things going on. For example, in this session I'm going to talk about ConfigMgr. 15.11, the current branch, the only platform available right now to support fully Windows 10 deployment and management. And when that platform was released, it was released together with the ADK 15.11, which doesn't work with ConfigMgr 15.11. It took the Twitter stream about 4 seconds to explode with warnings. Hey, don't do this. Use the old version instead. It took Microsoft a good few days to create an article, a blog post, with the same information. So Twitter can be a lifesaver from time to time, especially around Patch Tuesday and days like that. So follow me and check the people I follow, because I follow the absolute experts in the world related to Windows 10 deployments and ConfigMgr. So this is me. This is where I live, not on the beach, but close to the beach. I live in Halmstad in Sweden. I spend my days or work as a consultant, Knowledge Factory, these days Avania. And I've been doing this for a while. Been consulting in doing OSD for 26 years now. So it's been a fun ride. It was easier back then, copying a floppy and then you were done. Not so anymore. When I don't do consulting, I write books. I think that's fun. That's my idea of having a vacation, writing books. Family is not as intrigued as I am, but I like it. Now, today we're focusing on ConfigMgr and MDT only. The base platform is ConfigMgr, welcome. But 99% of what I'm demonstrating here today happens to work in MDT Light Touch 2. It's not by planning, it's just that the integration is so tight in between these solutions. In fact, it's the actual same team within Microsoft, same organization, that is responsible for developing these solutions. They even have the same program manager, Mr. Aaron Tchaikovsky, is managing those teams. So, throughout the day or throughout this hour, I'm going to demonstrate using a bunch of VMs that I'm hosting on my laptop. And this environment is available for download. So, I will show you shortly how that works. But if you want to spin up a lab and test environment doing the exact same stuff that I've been demonstrating to you here today, feel free to do so. It's an automated build. It takes about 2 hours, and then you have a complete lab environment in an isolated network that you can actually lab and test with things very easily. So with that being said, let's start there. Get the lab up and running. On my blog, which I, whoops, can't even type to. If you search for the keyword hydration, and the blog is named Deployment Research. Confession, I used to have an old blog back in the days named Deploy Vista. I really thought that was going to take off back then. It didn't. It's still around. It's still an archive, but this is my main blog for now. So if you search for hydration, unfortunately has nothing to do with beer, but it's a concept of building automated solutions, in this case a lab environment. And when you do a search, you will find 8 or 9 different hits on hydration. But the one I'm demonstrating to you here today is the one for ConfigMgr current branch, or ConfigMgr 15.11, as it's named also as well, or the current version is. So this is a massive download, obviously. I will just start zoom it for the people in the cheap seats in the room. You can fit it on a floppy. It's that big download. So it's just a PowerShell script and a ready-made MDT deployment share. So what you do, you download this zip file, and what you get is a folder structure that looks like this. There is a PowerShell script, you run that PowerShell script, and it creates a deployment share in MDT. Then you have some job to do. You need to copy some files, and that's why we can keep the download small, and that's why we can, or I can have this solution out there without upsetting Microsoft lawyers. Because if I would add in all the binaries also in the download, I will probably have them on my tail. But it's not that difficult. These instructions in the blog post, step by step, download this, copy that to that folder, download that, copy it to that folder. So, but if you think about it, an educated guess, this folder here, what would you add to it if you didn't read the blog post? Yes, of course, the server media. What would you add to the application's ConfigMgr folder? Well, the ConfigMgr media. Same goes with SQL. Copy in the SQL media. So you do this. You copy and paste some files into the right folders. That's typically done in 4 or 5 minutes. It takes you about 30 minutes to find the media, but that's another story. So once you have done that, what you actually got when you run the PowerShell script is a ready-made deployment share with a media. And when you right-click that media and do update, it creates a giant ISO file for you that is bootable. So now the only thing you need to do is to create a few VMs. So either you can open up the virtual machine manager or Hyper-V console, NIC 2016, DC01, store the VM somewhere, give it some memory, network, and a hard drive, and configure it to boot from that ISO. That's one way of doing it, which is fun if you do like one. If you do this all the time, it's not so fun anymore. So what you also find in the download, there is a extra folder which have ready-made PowerShell script that will create all the VMs as well and mount them on the ISO. So either way, either create a VM manually and mount it on the ISO, or use a PowerShell script to mount it on the ISO. And yes, this works in both Hyper-V and VMware. In fact, it works on every platform that can boot on an ISO, and most can. So I will take that VM that I created, I will simply power it on, and I will wait a little bit, boot on the ISO, and then you need to do an intelligent choice here. What to build for now? I recommend starting with the domain controller. The reason is all the other VMs is going to try to join that domain, and turns out that's going to be hard if you don't have a domain up and running at that point. So you select the domain controller, and you hit enter, and in 22 minutes you have a domain controller. And not only a domain controller, DHCP server and a complete PKI infrastructure too. Then you leave that VM running, and you create a second VM. You boot on the same ISO, and you select one of the other servers. For example, the ConfigMgr server that will build your site server with ConfigMgr 1511. And then you have your lab. Done. Less than 2 hours total time. Pretty cool. If you leave this conference remembering only one thing, I would like that to be that you guys are indeed, and your manager can get that in writing for me if he or she wants, worthy of a nice solid-state drive. Because with that, you can actually build lab environments on any machine these days. If you are really lucky, not very likely though, but if you are, you get the drive like this. This is a 13 terabyte, 2.5-inch SSD drive.
How much?
$13,000. The question was how much. So, and you need two, of course, redundancy, yes. Or you stripe them, so you get 26. But think about this. This is the first year where SSDs actually bypasses or surpasses mechanical disks. I think the largest one you can buy now is like 10. Normal disk. And that's a 3.5-inch. This is tiny, and it's that big. Samsung is releasing a 16 terabyte this year. Give this a few years and we will have a lot of storage. This is fun. But the thing is, with a solid-state drive, you can actually do magic. We have a lot of, and we actually have a session tomorrow, me, Michael Nystrom, and Andreas Hammarskjöld, where we are building a home lab. And we base that on a few different devices, but one of the devices that we demonstrate on how to set up and use is the Intel NUC devices. They just released the 6th generation Skylake CPUs on those. You can put a 2 terabyte SSD on that one. Eventually you will get larger modules, but even now you can get 32 gigs of RAM in a box that is like this big. And it's quiet. I use one of those as media PC back home too, but this is enough to run a lab. And that's a $300 PC. And then you have to spend like $500 on memory, but that's another story. And $300 for the disk. But this is everything you need. Then you have a complete lab environment. If you want to customize this, this is just an MDT deployment chair. This is the sequence that builds the domain controller. If you don't like what I have done, change it. This is just an automated build. DNS, Active Directory, DHCP, Active Directory structures, OUs, subnets, PKI infrastructures, scripts that just builds this. Same goes with ConfigMgr. That sequence, normal server deployment, but in the end, .NET components, Pixie, IS, prereqs, remote differential compression, ADK, and of course, it's this version of the ADK, because as I mentioned this morning when talking about Twitter, 15.11 doesn't work. They forgot kind to test that. Every deployment that stages WinP on the hard drive, which is most, doesn't work with this release. So the question is, fine, how do I get this version then? Because if you go to Microsoft Download and search for ADK, you don't find it. So how do you find it? How do you get the right version for ConfigMgr? Well, you remember the program manager's name, Aaron, configuration manager, and 15.11. Ta-da! Let's see, issue. There we go. There's the blog post from the team saying, oops, sorry. But in the end of that blog post, there is the link to the older version of the ADK. And that's where you can download it and find it. So anyway, they will fix it eventually. In fact, they already have fixed it. They just haven't figured out how to release a new version of ADK yet, because that ties to the Windows releases as well. So we need to wait for new Windows 10 release too. So it takes some time. That will be Redstone, by the way. If you want to customize this, every configuration is hidden as usual for ConfigMgr and for MDT in this text file structure. So have one ini file for like generic settings. Language, time zone, things like that. Then, unlike a normal config manager setup, I actually have one ini file per sequence, just to keep them separate. So for example, in my domain controller sequence, this is the ini file that configures it with the IP address, sets the name, sets the Active Directory information, the domain name and all that, and also creates the DHCP configuration. If you want something different subnets, different domain name, change this one, update the file, ISO, and build, and you're done. On the blog post, there are some, in the end, additional something configuration, yeah. Which files you need to update where. Simple as that, if you want to customize it further. So there are no excuses anymore for not having a good lab setup. It's that easy to build. So once we have that, we can start to have fun with it. And the first thing is obviously, when we do deployments these days, Windows 10 deployments, you need a reference image. I do not recommend to use ConfigMgr to build it, even if you use ConfigMgr to deploy it. Basically because it sometimes, first of all, it takes much longer. And there are issues with it right now, and always have been. You can get it done, but you simply spend too much time on it, in my opinion. So I like to use Light Touch. The standalone version. And the why? Because it always bloody works. Every single time. And the image you get out of it, you can use with anything. So I happen to have an MDT server. There is apparently a demo slide here. And for those of you attending the pre-conference yesterday, how many did that, by the way? A few of you. Do you remember how difficult it was to create a reference image? This is the entire process, so bear with me, because this is going to be massive, very, very complicated. You open up a PowerShell prompt, and you try to type correctly. I'm being distracted by a camera woman right there. You go to a folder, and you run a PowerShell script. Done. That's it. In an hour and a half, I have a Vim file on my server, on my ConfigMgr server. Windows 10, all the runtimes, all the apps, fully patched, everything. It's fully automated. And you need to have enough memory available on the host to create VMs, apparently. But I should be able to fix that. Let me do some house cleaning. Here we go, try again. That works better. So this VM is now running, doing a normal light touch deployment, creating that Vim file. Simple as that. Now, the backend obviously is the MDT server. This concept is called Image Factory, where you automate builds all the time. And I can't type either. This is a normal deployment here. I've added in some applications. I've added in the operating system, 15.11 on Windows 10. I created a sequence that deploys Windows 10. Just a basic sequence, but I added in some components to it. .NET 3.5, include 3 and 2, some runtimes. This is just the VB script wrapper that installs all the runtimes. You can download that from my blog as well. Then I run Windows Update, and then the sequence automatically sysprep and captures the Vim and store it on the server. If you want to take this one step further, I have a partner in crime, Mr. Michael Nystrom. We are typically writing all the deployment fundamentals books together. He has a blog post or a blog site, blog, Deployment Bunny. And if you do a search for Image Factory, he has an even bigger PowerShell script. The difference with this PowerShell script and the one I showed you, I mean, this one here is just creating a single VM and deploys it with a ready-made sequence. This PowerShell script here will build an image for each sequence that you have on your deployment share. So you can have a Windows 7, a Windows 10, a Windows Server 2008 to R2, and a Server 2012 R2. You run the PowerShell script and it spits out 4 Vim files that are fully up to date with all the settings and apps and whatever you need in them. So it doesn't get more automated than that. And again, the back end is a simple deployment share. I just automated everything in it. All right. So that was reference images and the Image Factory. Then, as I mentioned, to support Windows 10, you need to be on ConfigMgr 15.11, also named current branch. That's the download name when you go to the volume license site and get it. For now, in March or April or February, there will be a different version. Because Microsoft now versioned these like with the year and the month. So 15.11 was obviously November last year. I'm still waiting for the release of March, the year 2020, and the July release of 2020, and also the December release of 2020. Because then we have SMS 2003 all along again, and ConfigMgr 2007, and ConfigMgr 2012. Interesting. Anyway, what I have here is a site server running ConfigMgr 15.11. It's this one right here. I have added in 2 images. One, the reference image I built in LightTouch. I simply copied it over and added it in, either through the UI or through PowerShell. And I also added in this one. This is the default Microsoft image, used for upgrades. You need to have 2 images these days. The reference image, that's the one you're using for bare metal deployments. You use it for refresh scenarios, and you use it for computer replay scenarios. That's why you have your ref image. However, for the in-place upgrade for Windows 10, that's where you're using the default media. Because you cannot use a custom image. You can't have anything in it. Not a single application. It breaks. So once you have added those images in, you obviously create your boot images. You add in your drivers. You create your driver packages for Windows 10. And then you create your sequences. And there are many different ways to create sequences, of course, but the default behavior is you typically run through a wizard. And you click next, next, finish a bunch of times and do the configuration. Once the configuration is done, you typically need to do some customizations to it. And as I demonstrated in the session yesterday, there are 3 things you need to do to the default templates to have them fully support all the config manager scenarios. The first thing you need to do is in the installed section. You need to configure this variable, set it to true. The default is false. This will make sure that every Windows that you deploy, Windows 7, BIOS-based, UEFI-based, well, obviously not Windows 7, but Windows 10 BIOS and UEFI-based, will end up on the C drive, rather than D or E or F. This basically says to you, hey, honor what we had in the reference image, and MDT always builds it to the C drive. The second thing you need to do is to go to the Apply Network step and pick something for the OU. Because if you don't, you cannot change it dynamically during deployment. And this is one of the key pillars to have, or key reasons to have the integration in ConfigMgr with MDT 2013 Update 2. That's the only version that is tested on that platform. Because that will allow you to do things like this. For example, detect using built-in functions if it's a laptop or a desktop. And if it's a laptop, put it in that OU. If it's a desktop, put it in that OU. Simple text file. The sequence reads this and figures out through built-in functions, actually WMyQuery in the backend that asks for chassis types. And of course, the only software on the planet or hardware on the planet that doesn't support this is Surface. Remind me again, which vendor is behind this hardware? Yeah, anyway. You can use model for Surface, and you can do it that way. That works. So what you can have is you can have model, and you can say, hey, all right, add in model. And the Surface Pro 3 or 4, whatever you have. English keyboard. And you probably want to put that in the same OU as laptops. Or maybe a tablet one, I don't know. So this is how you can feed instructions to the sequence. You can have a single sequence that just behaves differently dynamically when you deploy it. And the cool thing about this ini file, this rules engine file, is that you can very easily simulate it. So I'm not going to save those changes, but I'll go back to the one I had. So I can open a PowerShell prompt, go to that folder, and run the simulation. What if I would deploy this machine? What would the sequence do? And I get it directly in the log file here. It would name it like this, because it was a laptop. It will put them into the laptop's OU, and it will install the following applications in ConfigMgr. The first two apps came, from the default section. Everybody gets those. But since this was a laptop, it also added in the VPN client to it. But again, I can avoid hard-coding things in the sequence, but simply have it in an ini file, and I can simulate this without having to waste an hour to deploy something just to realize that I did something wrong. This is very efficient. Other than that, in terms of drivers, you do what you always have done. You disable the auto apply, and you add in driver packages instead. Much more reliable than the plug-and-play ID detection. And then you have conditions. Either WMI queries, like this one, or variable model equals whatever model it is. Or you can use model alias scripts, then it will be model alias. Shorthand, you put conditions on those packages. It's been like this forever, since CMOS 7 at least. Now, once you have all that, you need to decide what type of automation level do you want. The default behavior in ConfigMgr is everything is automated. The default behavior in light touch, it will stop and ask you a bunch of questions. But I demonstrated to you that it's possible to automate light touch through everything. But you can also do the same thing in ConfigMgr. You can ask for things. You can prompt for information. One way of doing that, it's not a very good way of doing that, but one way is simply go to a collection to which you have deployed a sequence. For example, all unknown computers. You go properties on that one. You go to collection variables. You add a variable, but you do not provide a value for it. You just add it in. And if you do, it will stop and prompt you. Please type in the computer name. It's not very elegant. You need to double-click and next and so forth, but it does it. Another way, as I demonstrated yesterday, is to use the UDI integration. There is a wizard that you can enable that contains by default 11 ready-made wizard panes, and you can also customize these. For example, there is one can ask for computer name and OU and things like that. How do you enable this wizard? It's not enabled by default. How do you enable it? Well, when you create a sequence, there is a question. Do you want to use zero touch, or do you want to use user-driven installation? The latter choice is the wizard. But what if you already have a sequence that you are very happy with? Fantastic sequence, your best ever. And you would like this sequence to use the wizard. How do you fix it? Any educated ideas here? Yes. Flip yes to no, exactly. It's not that hard. Then you use the wizard. The downside of the UDI wizard is that it's not being displayed in the very beginning. And that's why you normally want to have these changes. It absolutely displays about 2 minutes into the setup, which kind of sucks, really. But that's how it works. I will show you a different method later. So that was deploying Windows 10, and then of course we have sequences. We can do pretty advanced stuff in sequences. Ah. So the question was, yesterday I showed you some tips and tricks that you can add in top of the sequence. Yes, absolutely. Let me show you those. I typically do this for Windows 10 deployments. I instruct the sequence when it's done to do a final reboot. And I do this to force a group policy refresh, because the ConfigMgr sequence will suppress all policies. And sometimes you want them to apply when the machine comes up. It could be BitLocker policies, it could be anything that you want to apply. The other one I typically add is this one here, the timeout when things go wrong. Because by default it's 15 minutes. And I don't like that, so I set it up to a full day, so that I actually know and the sequence breaks. So, anyway, sequences, modifications, demo, awesome. I'm not too much for slides, you probably realize that by now. The thing is, the sequences that you configure in ConfigMgr, what if you or a coworker does something stupid to a sequence, like delete it or modify it so it doesn't work? It happens. How do you get it back to the original state? I mean, in ConfigMgr, if you have an application and you do something incredibly stupid to an application, if you're lucky, you will have the revision history of the app, so you can just restore a previous version of the app, or the configuration of the app. Sequences doesn't have that. So how do you get back a sequence that you broke, or deleted, even worse? Any ideas? You know, crying is acceptable, but it doesn't help. You need to restore the site server to get back a sequence. That's no fun. I recommend PowerShell, because it happens to be that with a few lines of PowerShell you can export sequences. So if I go to this folder here, which as you can see is empty, I mean, you can do an export in the UI. I can select the sequence and export it. If I'm lucky, it only takes 30 minutes per sequence. That's one way of doing it. Or I export them all in 7 seconds. So either spend 5 hours or PowerShell and 7 seconds. Pick and choose. Now I have the sequences here. Yes? The comment is, depends if you charge by the hour. Yes, if you're a consultant, do not listen to what I said. Or maybe spend some time on some more useful things than right-clicking and run through wizards. But I get your point. Thank you. So the thing is, now I have a backup of all my sequences. And if I want to create a new one, I simply do that. Import sequence, site code, sequence name, NIC 2016, Windows 10, something. And I specify from which backup file do I want this. And let me just check which one Windows 10 was. It was C, end with C. This one. Enter, done, restored. So now if I go back to my console, I have 11 sequences right now. If I do a refresh, I will have 12. And this is my NIC sequence being restored from the backup. Easier than a site restore. There is another partner in crime, really. 2 summers ago, I spent most of my summer in Germany together with Mike Koster, and we wrote this book, Stealing with Pride, 400 pages on advanced OSD customizations. Mike, on his blog, has an event handler for ConfigMgr. And they apparently liked it, so that's good. That triggers every time someone edits a sequence. It runs a script. So if you configure that handler to run this script that I showed you here, you get a backup every time someone touches a sequence. And it will add a version number to that backup, allowing you to very easily go back in time and simply restore one if something breaks. Or create a copy and test something else. But this is so powerful, being able to get that version control in ConfigMgr for sequences. Because after a while, you will have complex sequences. You will have hundreds of actions here. You probably spend a good few hours on it too. It's nice to be able to work with that. And yes, you can download those PowerShell scripts from my blog. Just search for sequences. Monitoring is nice. MDT adds real-time monitoring for ConfigMgr. So meaning when you start deployments, you can see them in real time in the monitoring node in the workbench, if you have any running. But what you also can do, and let me go over to my MDT server for this one. You can, of course, test some deployments or create some deployments. Let me see if it was elevated. It wasn't. And another camera person. They multiply. It's interesting. So if I go to a folder where I have some PowerShell scripts, this is a script I was using when testing how many deployments the monitoring feature would allow at the same time, and it died around 5,000. So don't deploy more than 5,000 at the exact same time. It will break. But I can do 10. So now I have 10 deployments. Happy, done. And this information I can view in a web browser. I can view it in PowerShell. Just spit it out in the grid view. It's just an OData feed. Or, why not open Excel. And connect Excel to a OData feed. And type in the link to your monitoring server. Next. Next. Finish. Yes. Okay. I have my deployments in Excel. I can refresh it as long as I want, or often as I want. I can do coloring. I can create pie charts. I can do diagrams. I can do anything that managers like. But this is just a way to get real-time information about your deployments. Start time, end time, things like that. And of course, you can extend this too. One of the projects in the book I mentioned is how you can extend monitoring with more information, additional stuff that you feed into it. Before MDT update 1, this typically killed the site server after a while because it logged so much information if you had a temp folder present. They have now fixed it by simply commenting out that code block for that web service. So you don't need to worry about that anymore. But this is a very nice way to do deployments. And I will cover, I have a troubleshooting session later today, 2:20, while we go into more details on the monitoring piece. But I like this one. And that was the demo. So, what about sequence testing? What if you have scripts that you develop that you want to be able to test very quickly? Well, turns out there is a way to do this. This is a very small sequence, obviously. The way I created the sequence was simply create a sequence and select the custom template that is included by default in MDT. That will create a really small sequence. So if I go back to this really small sequence, I've added one action to it. And I added a command line that is using Service UI to start a normal command prompt. What's the benefit of this? What's the point? It runs the command prompt as the sequence. The sequence will normally suppress everything that interacts with it. With this component, you can interact with it. And that's a component from MDT. And the thing is, you can now run your script as many times as you like. Change it, run it, until you nail it. And then you put that on a packet somewhere and deploy it. If you don't do this, you are spending like 10-15 minutes for every change you do to the script. Because you change the script, you replace it in the package, you update the package, you distribute it to the DP at that process, you wait, you download the new policy to the client, you can run the script again. And you continue to do that. But this allows you to just run it over and over every single time. The only thing you need to remember is obviously not this command line because it's that long, but it's the Service UI component and my last name. I have a pretty unique last name. We are 10 people in the world with that name, and I'm the only one so far, thankfully, not doing OS deployment. We'll find it. A blog post, 4 years old, but this is how you do it. Add an action, run a command line. That's it. This is how it looks. allow it to run scripts. Prior to ConfigMgr 2012 R2 SP1, you typically needed to adjust log file sizes. Microsoft has fixed that now, so the logging is much better in 15.11. So they bumped up the size to 2 megs, and they also reduced the amount of logging information in it. So they are logging more relevant information rather than just a bunch of junk stuff. What you also can do to get the information, of course, is the log files. And by default, they're client-side, but you can configure them to be server-side as well. You also, in ConfigMgr, in the monitoring node, you have your reports. And there is a bunch of, well, a few at least, task sequence progress reports that you can run to get information about your deployments. You can also create queries. Here is a query for OS deployment status for Windows 10 sequences, where I simply added in a select statement with filters on a specific deployment ID for my sequence. So I can run this and get information about that deployment too. This was natively added in CMOS 7. Very nice feature. They removed it in ConfigMgr 12. But it's not that difficult to create a new query or create a bunch of them, whatever you like. So that's useful. All right. What else? Settings. Well, ConfigMgr doesn't really have much other options than variables to provide settings to deployments. And I don't like, never have, using collection variables, or even worse, resources or variables on devices directly, because I don't like the UI to assign them. I much rather prefer to use the MDT database. Not only because it's designed to store OSD settings. ConfigMgr wasn't back in the days. But it also had ready-made fields for every possible setting that you can imagine. Computer name, regional settings, OUs, apps, whatever. And you can extend it too. You can add in your own custom fields if you like to this one as well. And the wizard or the UI will automatically update when you do so. The way you call this in ConfigMgr is simply you go to your ini file that the sequence is using. And you try to find it. Put it somewhere. And you instruct it to go ask the database for settings by adjusting some lines in the text file. Config manager server, the database, the protocol, the view in question. It says table, but it's a view. So this simply constructs a SQL query. Select star from, computer settings where, MAC address equals, whatever. And everything that it spits back, it's being used by the sequence directly. Very nice. If you don't like this UI, and I don't blame you if you don't like this UI, there are other UIs available. For example, there is a guy in a country to the east, Sweden. He put together an HTA that you can download from Codeplex, MDT admin codeplex.com, which allow you to very easily create new computers and connect them to one or more roles. That's what it does. And a role is just a very convenient way of group settings together. OUs, config manager applications, config manager packages, things like that. You just group them together. And then you connect that role into a machine. Nice stuff. Of course, it can go more advanced. You can use web services, server-side code to retrieve settings that are being used for OS deployment. The beautiful thing about this, it's actually code running on the server side. It's managed code, C# or VB.NET typically. But you can do magic with this. So if I go to a client that I have here, if I can find it. First of all, if you go to Codeplex and you search for a pretty good front end, this is a sample front end you can use with ConfigMgr. Unlike UDI, this one is being displayed directly when you start the deployment. And it's an HTA, so it's a text file. If you ever worked with HTML in your entire life, you can modify this. It's basically HTML2 with VB script in the back end. But the components that talks to this one are web services. And you can download them as well, including the source code from this site. And the reason I decided to include the source code is because if you go to your security team and say that, hey, by the way, I found a DLL on internet. I think the guy is trustworthy who wrote it. Can I add that to our site server? They go, no, can't do that. But you also give them the source code. They can review the source code. They can hire someone to review the source code, hire a developer. Because the source code for the web services, it's so small. Very, like 30 lines of code per method, give or take. It takes an experienced developer like 30 minutes to review that code to say if it's either good or not so good. So Visual Studio, each method, not too many lines of code. A new method, lines of code. And of course, it's easy to modify and customize this when you have a working example. It's harder to create it from scratch yourself. So as an example, if I open one of these web services, where did I put you? I can probably use this one. This is a web service with 9 different methods. 1 to add a machine to a collection. 1 to get roles from the database. 1 to get sequences from ConfigMgr. I have one here I can show you actually. Let's see. This retrieves OUs from Active Directory and spits it back to an XML file. This one retrieves sequences from ConfigMgr that have been deployed as hidden in the console. So then I can combine this by using a front end that requests these. The one I showed you here. It's simply using those variables to populate the drop-down for OUs and the drop-down for images, which is really sequences. So the only thing I did different in the console was that when I were deploying that sequence in ConfigMgr, for example, I could do my Windows 10 sequence. I deploy it somewhere, and I select deploy as hidden, meaning it's not available, but it is available in my front end because I have a web service that lists them for me and requests them from the site server. And now you can do some advanced filtering. You can add a logon dialog box to this that is using groups in Active Directory. So if you're a member of that group, you get the following list. If you're a member of that group, you then get another list of sequences. If you're part of the client team, you get client sequences. If you're part of the server team, you get server sequences. Because again, this is just a text file. So either you do the filtering here, or you modify the web service to filter it for you, depending on group membership things. Another thing I've been using web services for a lot of well, quite a few installations at least, is I'm using it to assign applications. Because a lot of companies, they use groups in Active Directory to assign apps used through OSD. So they will have, in Active Directory, they will have a bunch of, in this case 3, but groups that are named of the app. And they have a collection structure that mimics this. And they have a query on the collection, so if you're a member of this Active Directory group, you get the app in ConfigMgr when you push them out. But what we did, or I did, on the app itself, or the group in Active Directory, I borrowed an unused attribute, admin description, in which I actually typed in the package in ConfigMgr directly. For Acrobat Reader, same thing, the package for Acrobat Reader. But for Skype, I added in the Skype application model app. And then I have a web service. That lists packages, so I can type in a computer name, PC number 2. And PC number 2 is a member of these 3 groups. And it will figure out that, all right, I'm supposed to have 7-zip and Adobe Reader. If I ask for apps, oops, did not mean to do that. List applications, PC number 2. It will show me Skype. The only thing I need to do now is instruct MDT to call it. Typically use a script to do that. But that's it. So now the sequence, during deployment, figures out that if my machine is a member of those group, it goes directly and requests those packages and applications and have the sequence install them. Fantastic if you're refreshing machines and you want this machine to have the same apps as it had before. Because the help desk has been working with that machine for 2 years, assigning apps to groups. So if I re-image the machine, we'll get the same apps again. But not after the sequence is done, 2 hours later, during the sequence. So this is another way of using web services. So that was web services. Troubleshooting, I did mention the log file. I did show you the monitoring node. The server-side logging feature, it's been around for a long time. This is how we enable it. If you add a one-liner into your text file, this is it. If something breaks, it will copy the logs file to the server. And not only the SMST's log file, all the log files that are related to this. The session at 2:20 today, it's an hour about log files basically, but troubleshooting. So I'll be able to dive into more details about that. But with that, I basically have one more thing to say. Check out these resources, trainings, videos, books, OS deployment stuff, Windows 10 stuff, and thank you for attending. Have a great conference.